The air in the community hall was thick with the scent of lilies and the quiet, performative grief of people who barely knew my father. I sat in the front row, a statue in a black dress, my face a carefully constructed mask of neutrality I'd perfected over 2 decades. My phone vibrated against my leg, a silent, urgent pulse in the suffocating stillness. I glanced down, shielding the screen with my hand. The contact was labeled Overwatch, and the message was just 5 words. Stay still. She's recording. My eyes lifted, slowly, deliberately, and scanned the pews. And there she was, Tiffany, my stepbrother's fiancée, a woman whose loyalty was as shallow as her smile. Was filming me from 3 rows back, her phone barely concealed behind a hymn book. A cold, familiar calm washed over me, the kind that settles in when you see a threat you've already anticipated. This was their game, not mine. I thought of all the times they'd tried to catch me off guard, to provoke a reaction they could point to as proof of my instability. My thumb moved with practiced efficiency, typing back a single word that held the weight of a dozen contingency plans. Haven. I hit send. A moment later, a chair creaked to my left, then another to my right. A dozen people scattered throughout the hall, a woman in a floral dress, a man who looked like a bored accountant, a young couple holding hands, rose to their feet in eerie unison. They didn't rush. They moved with a silent, fluid purpose that sent a ripple of confusion through the room. At the podium, my stepbrother Caleb faltered mid-sentence, his carefully crafted eulogy dissolving on his tongue as he watched the scene unfold. Just an hour earlier, he had pulled me aside at the entrance, his grip on my arm a little too tight. He stood there, the charismatic city councilman, next to his mother, my father, second wife, a woman who treated family peace like a hostage negotiation. She offered me that look, the one reserved just for me, a blend of pity and impatience. Caleb's voice was a low hiss, a performance for an audience of one. Anna, please, he began. Just for today, try to look like you belong. I know your little courthouse job is quiet, but this is important for Dad's legacy. The condescension dripped from every word, a familiar poison I'd learned to metabolize long ago. He patted my shoulder, a gesture meant to dismiss. Don't mention it to anyone. It's embarrassing. That word, embarrassing, hung in the air between us. It wasn't just my job he was talking about. I saw the science fair trophies he'd called nerdy clutter, the university acceptance letter he'd dismissed as a fluke. 10 years of money is tight when I needed help, right before he got a new car for graduation. It was all there in that one final insult. I gave him the same blank nod I always did, my silence the one thing he could never manipulate. What he didn't see as he turned to glad hand a donor was the man standing just behind them. Deputy Director Evans, my mentor, a man whose silence held more authority than Caleb's loudest speech, his gaze unreadable as he clocked the entire pathetic exchange. Caleb thought he was protecting our father's legacy by silencing my embarrassing job. He had no idea he'd just tried to manage the optics in front of the man who signs off on my high-threat witness relocation files. To understand the reckoning that was about to unfold in that quiet hall, you have to understand the 2 lives I was living. To understand the 2 lives I was living, you have to go back a year, to a family dinner celebrating my stepbrother. The memory is so vivid, the clinking of crystal glasses, the scent of my step, mother's overpriced perfume, the suffocating warmth of forced celebration. My late father, a respected businessman whose handshake often felt more like a contract, was holding court at the head of the table. He was raising a glass of champagne to Caleb, whose face was flushed with self-satisfaction. He'd just secured city funding for a new park, a minor political win he'd spun into a monumental achievement. To Caleb, my father boomed, his voice full of a pride he never showed me. Building a legacy, son. That's what it's all about. The family applauded, their faces glowing in the candlelight. They saw him as the heir apparent, a brilliant politician cleaning up the city. I saw a man who was simply sanitizing our family's history, putting a respectable public face on a foundation of secrets. Later, during a lull in the conversation, I tried to share a piece of my own news. I received a commendation at work this week, I said quietly. My father glanced at me, his attention already drifting. That's nice, sweetie, he said, taking a sip of his wine. Did you file all the papers correctly? The question hung in the air, a perfect summary of my perceived existence. I wasn't a person, I was a function, a pair of hands that filed paperwork. Caleb leaned forward, a smirk playing on his lips. Probably for perfect attendance, right, Anna? He chuckled. Don't worry, we're proud of you for sticking with it. Sticking with it. As if my career were some unfortunate hobby I refused to give up. I felt the familiar cold weight settle in my stomach. The commendation was for successfully coordinating a multi-agency operation that prevented a federal judge from being targeted. It had involved 72 hours of no sleep, a dozen agents, and a level of logistical complexity Caleb couldn't even begin to comprehend. To them, it was just paperwork. But there was another room. Another me. That room was a sterile, windowless box deep in a federal building, known as a TOC, a Tactical Operations Center. The only light came from a wall of glowing screens, displaying building schematics, satellite feeds, and a digital threat matrix that pulsed with data. Here, I wasn't Anna, the quiet clerk. I was Haven, my operational call sign. And in this room, my voice was absolute. I remember one night staring at the screens, my heart a slow, steady drum in the silent tension. My team was on the ground, moving to extract a high-value witness from a compromised safe house. Confirm egress route 2 is clear, I said into my headset, my voice calm and even. The reply came back, laced with static and stress. Route 2 is hot, Haven, repeat, hot. I zoomed in on the schematics, my mind racing through protocols. The primary plan was shot. The secondary was a trap. We have a compromised OPSEC on the primary, I stated, my eyes tracking the heat signatures of hostiles closing in. The asset is non-compliant. A rookie might have panicked. But I just breathed. Move to soft extraction now. Use the service tunnels. I'll override the magnetic locks from here. There was a pause, and then the voice of my team lead. Copy, Haven. On your mark. In that moment, a quiet nod of approval from Deputy Director Evans, who stood silently behind me, meant more than a lifetime of my father's hollow praise. My family thought my job was my weakness, a boring little secret to be hidden away because it lacked the glamour of politics. The truth is, it was my shield. It was my deliberate rejection of the world my father had built. His business empire was shadowed by rumors that clung to our family name like expensive cologne. Whispers of backroom deals and connections to organized crime that never quite went away. He was a master of plausible deniability, and Caleb had learned from the best. My stepbrother wasn't building a new legacy, he was laundering the old one, using his political ambition to whitewash the sins of the father while secretly leveraging those same dark contacts for his own gain. I saw the rot at the heart of it all. So I chose a different path. I chose federal law enforcement, a world of hard lines, clear rules, and consequences. To my family, this wasn't a noble choice. It was a betrayal. It was a silent judgment on their entire way of life. They couldn't comprehend it, so they belittled it. My quiet little job was their defense mechanism. By making me small, they could ignore the uncomfortable truth my very existence represented. They needed me to be a failure, because my success would mean that their own definition of it was a lie. For years, I let them believe the fiction. It was easier. It kept me separate from the world our father built. But when Caleb decided to use our father's memorial as a stage for his own dark ambitions, he brought his world crashing into mine. He forgot one key rule of my profession: I control the board. My decision to act wasn't born from years of petty slights or family drama. It was a professional imperative. The moment intelligence confirmed that a key federal witness would be at my father's memorial to pay his respects, everything changed. This man was the linchpin in the case against the very syndicate my father had been connected to, and Caleb was using this sacred event as a hunting ground. The syndicate planned to use the memorial to identify and intimidate the witness, with my stepbrother acting as their spotter. My attendance was no longer personal. It was an official U.S. Marshal's protective detail, operating under the perfect cover of a grieving daughter. Revenge was a luxury I couldn't afford. This was about mission success. The day before the service, I stood before my team in a sterile briefing room. These were the faces who would become anonymous mourners, their grief as manufactured as the flowers on the casket. I pointed to a floor plan of the hall on a large screen. The asset will be seated in Sector 4, I began, my voice even and methodical. Our people will form a containment perimeter. Caleb is the primary internal threat. His fiancée, Tiffany, is the secondary. It felt strange and clinical to label them that way, but in this context, that's exactly what they were: threats. We assume all public-facing moments are compromised. Code Haven initiates a full ghost extraction. We will use their surveillance against them. My team nodded, their expressions serious. They didn't see a grieving daughter, they saw their commanding officer. Just before I walked into the hall, Deputy Director Evans intercepted me in the quiet corridor. He was there as my official supervisor, my top cover, a silent, imposing presence that gave the entire operation institutional weight. He didn't offer condolences. He was all business. He pressed a small, discreet comms device into my hand. "The attorney's office is ready to move on Caleb," he said, his voice a low murmur. "But they need something incontrovertible. An overt act." He paused, his gaze steady and clear. "Your call, Marshal." Those 3 words were the validation I had spent my entire life unknowingly fighting for. It wasn't about family anymore. This was a federal case, and the authority to spring the trap, it was mine. Caleb arrived surrounded by his political allies, ready to deliver a performance. I arrived surrounded by my team, ready to do my job. He thought the cameras were there for him. He was right, just not in the way he imagined. Caleb stood at the podium, bathed in the soft, respectful light of the memorial hall. He had the crowd in the palm of his hand, playing the part of the grieving son with practiced perfection. But as he spoke, his eulogy began to curdle, twisting from remembrance into a passive-aggressive lecture aimed directly at me. "My father understood ambition," Caleb said, his voice resonating with false sincerity. "He understood building something. He was disappointed by those who chose to hide from the world, who chose a small, quiet life." His eyes, for just a fraction of a second, flicked towards me in the front row. I felt the familiar heat of 100 similar accusations: the nerdy bookworm, the quiet girl, the unambitious daughter. "But he loved them anyway," Caleb finished, the magnanimous politician offering a pardon I never asked for. It was a masterclass in public humiliation disguised as grace. Across the aisle I saw Tiffany raise her phone, the lens pointed squarely at me. She was waiting for the mask to crack, for the tears of hurt to flow. She wanted a clip of the pathetic little sister, broken by the Golden Boy's tribute. A coldness settled deep in my bones. This wasn't just a family gathering, it was a theater of cruelty, and I was the unwilling star. And then I saw it. It was a flicker of movement, almost imperceptible. Caleb's gaze shifted from me to a man sitting in the 4th row, a quiet man in a simple suit, the witness. For less than a second, Caleb's grief-stricken mask vanished, replaced by a look of pure ice. He made a subtle gesture with his hand, a quick slicing motion across his own throat. It was a threat, silent and deadly, delivered in a room full of mourners. At that exact instant, my phone buzzed with the text from Overwatch: "Stay still. She's recording." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Tiffany's recording wasn't just to humiliate me. It was to provide proof to the syndicate that Caleb had delivered the message, that he had held up his end of the bargain. He was using our father's memorial to sign a man's death warrant. My blood ran cold, but my mind was on fire. I didn't hesitate. I sent the one-word reply that would bring his entire world crashing down. Haven. The effect was immediate. Chairs creaked as a dozen of my marshals rose from the pews. They didn't run. They moved with the calm, efficient dread of true professionals. A silent, coordinated machine cutting through the confusion. 2 agents, the couple I'd seen holding hands earlier, flanked the witness, creating a human shield and guiding him swiftly toward a side exit. Others formed a barrier in the aisles, their bodies a living wall between the asset and any potential threat. The mourners gasped, their polite grief shattering into panicked whispers. Caleb's face went from shock to pure, unadulterated fury. His performance was ruined, his authority evaporating before his very eyes. What is the meaning of this? He roared from the podium, his voice cracking. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "Anna, what did you do?" His question echoed in the suddenly silent hall, an admission of his own powerlessness. He saw me, but he had no idea who he was looking at. That's when Deputy Director Evans stood up. His movements were slow, deliberate, drawing every eye in the room. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried an undeniable weight that cut through the chaos. "Everyone, please remain seated." he said calmly. Federal officers at work. He walked to the front of the hall, his presence sucking all the air out of Caleb's manufactured drama. He approached the podium and spoke into the microphone, his voice low and clear for everyone, and every recording device to hear. "Councilman," he said, looking my stepbrother dead in the eye, "you just attempted to intimidate a federal witness." He paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle, an act that was recorded. He gestured toward Tiffany, whose face had gone chalk white, her phone still clutched in her hand like a smoking gun. The room was utterly silent. Then, Deputy Director Evans turned his head slightly and looked directly at me. His expression was unreadable, but his words were a thunderclap in the stillness. "Thank you, Marshal Haven. The asset is secure." The name hung in the air, an impossible, world-altering fact. I watched Caleb's face as he processed it. Marshal Haven. The confusion, the denial, the dawning, horrific understanding. He looked at me, his invisible little stepsister, and for the first time in his life he saw the truth, a figure of immense and terrifying authority who had just dismantled his entire existence. For my entire life, Caleb had been the one on stage, the one with the microphone. In the end, all it took was one word from the audience to end his career. In the chaotic aftermath, the memorial service simply dissolved. I watched from the doorway as two plainclothes officers quietly escorted Caleb aside, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. My stepmother and Tiffany stood frozen, suddenly isolated and irrelevant in the sea of confused guests. They looked over at me, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and accusation. I didn't spare them a glance. My family was outside. My team was already gathered by the unmarked vehicles, the professional calm returning as soon as we cleared the building. The witness was secure, already in a black Suburban speeding away towards a new life. I stood with my people, conducting a quick professional debrief. There were no congratulations, no dramatic speeches, just quiet nods, clipped sentences confirming that protocols were followed, and the shared, unspoken understanding of a job well done. In that moment, surrounded by the quiet competence of my team, I felt a sense of belonging that the loud, hollow theatrics of my other family had never once given me. That night, I didn't mourn the family I'd lost. I finally, fully embraced the one I had chosen. 6 months passed. 6 months of quiet, focused work, of rebuilding the case files that Caleb's actions had nearly compromised. I was standing in the office of Deputy Director Evans, or rather, supervising Deputy U.S. Marshal Evans, as the new nameplate on his desk read. He gestured for me to sit. "The attorney's office sends its thanks," he began, getting straight to the point. Tiffany's phone was the gift that kept on giving. The recording, texts, contacts. It was a complete roadmap of the syndicate's political influence. He leaned back in his chair. Caleb was indicted on charges of witness tampering and conspiracy. His political career is over. He took a plea to avoid a longer sentence. There was no triumph in his voice, only a statement of fact. Then, his expression softened slightly. He slid a folder across his desk. "This leaves me with a vacancy to fill. My old position, lead field supervisor for the witness security program in this district." He let that sink in. "You didn't just protect the witness that day, Marshal. You protected the integrity of the entire operation. Under extreme personal and professional pressure." He looked at me, and for the first time I saw the mentor behind the supervisor. "You earned this." I looked at the folder, at the title I never thought I'd be considered for, and I didn't feel shock or even elation. I felt a quiet, profound sense of rightness. Now, I'm the one standing at the front of the briefing room. My team, a new team, my team, looks back at me, their faces attentive and serious. I don't rule with the bluster of my father or the charisma of my stepbrother. I lead with quiet competence, with the hard-won respect of my peers. We speak the same language, a language of procedure, of trust, of mutual protection. These people, who would walk through fire on my command just as I would for them, are my true legacy. It's a legacy not of inherited money or a sanitized family name, but one built on courage, integrity, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Last week, an email notification popped up on my screen. The sender was my stepmother. The subject line was just 2 words, "Anna, please." I hesitated for a moment, then opened it. It was exactly what I expected. A long, rambling message about Caleb's crushing legal fees, about the shame this had brought upon the family name, about how my father would be so disappointed. She was asking me for money, for help, for some kind of absolution for them. I read the final line, "We are still your family," and I felt nothing. No anger, no pity, not even the ghost of a sting. The words were hollow because the connection was gone. I calmly moved my cursor to the top of the message and clicked archive. My peace was finally, blessedly, my own. My stepbrother spent his life trying to shape our father's legacy in public, while I spent mine running from it in the shadows. In the end, a legacy isn't what people say about you at your memorial. It's what your actions prove when no one thinks they're watching. If you've ever had to operate in silence while others made all the noise, share your story below. In this community, your quiet competence is always seen.